Patrick Henry said, quote, "Where are your checks in this government? The most valuable end of government is the liberty of the inhabitants. No possible advantages can compensate for the loss of this privilege." End quote. On November 19th, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln spoke immortal words about the eternal mission for all Americans. Quote, "The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Citizens holding government accountable begins with knowing what their government at all levels is doing. Two long-standing legal concepts provide the framework for citizens being eternally vigilant and government officials being consistently accountable. Government documents should be public, and government meetings should be public. During the Virginia ratifying convention for the U.S. Constitution, Patrick Henry asserted public knowledge was the bulwark of protecting freedom. Quote, "The liberties of a people never were, nor ever will be, secure when the transactions of their rulers may be concealed from them." End quote. Where are your checks in this government? The most valuable end of government is the liberty of the inhabitants. No possible advantages can compensate for the loss of this privilege. Again, that's Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry's linkage of protecting liberty to citizen access echoed James Madison's commentary in Federalist 49, quote, "As the people are the only legitimate fountain of power, and it is from them that the constitutional charter, under which the several branches of government hold their power, is derived, it seems strictly consonant to the Republican theory to recur to the same original authority, not only whenever it may be necessary to enlarge, diminish, or new model the powers of the government, but also whenever any one of the departments may commit encroachments. It must be allowed to prove that a constitutional road to the decision of the people ought to be marked out and kept open." End quote. Madison raised concerns about those who aspire to unbridled power. Quote, "The same influence which had gained them an election into the legislature would gain them a seat in the convention. If this should not be the case with all, it would probably be the case with many, and pretty certainly with those leading characters on whom everything depends in such bodies. It is the reason alone of the public that ought to control and regulate the government." End quote. Public access to view the proceedings of House and Senate began in December 1795. The rapid growth of the federal government during President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal raised concerns about public access to executive branch documents and proceedings. Many of Roosevelt's new agencies had unprecedented powers to create laws and regulations outside the reach of Congress. On June 11th, 1946, the Administrative Procedures Act, APA, was enacted to reestablish balance between the legislative and executive branches. The APA also outlined how the public would be informed and allowed to comment on executive branch actions. 1. To require agencies to keep the public informed of their organization, procedures, and rules. 2. To provide for public participation in the rulemaking process, for instance, through public comment. 3. To establish uniform standards for the conduct of formal rulemaking and adjudication. 4. To define the scope of judicial review. The APA had its limitations, as bureaucrats continually found ways to avoid compliance. A more explicit federal law mandating public access to unclassified government meetings was the Government in the Sunshine Act, which was enacted September 13, 1976. Similar sunshine laws were enacted among state and local governments. However, to this day, citizens still have to file lawsuits to enforce public access as elected and appointed officials fail to provide, quote, adequate public notice, end quote, to hide questionable actions. The practice of the public accessing public documents began on December 2nd, 1766, 10 years before the American Revolution. Sweden passed the, quote, Freedom of the Press Act, end quote. Among other things, it gave Swedish citizens access to uncensored government documents. This was the first, quote, freedom of information, end quote, law in history. The world's first law requiring, quote, publicity for official documents, end quote, was initiated by the Finnish-Swedish Enlightenment thinker Anders Chydenius, a member of the Swedish Diet Parliament. Quote, no evidence should be needed that a certain freedom of writing and printing is one of the strongest bulwarks of a free organization of the state, as, without it, the estates would not have sufficient information for the drafting of good laws, and those dispensing justice would not be monitored, nor would the subjects know the requirements of the law, the limits of the rights of government, and their responsibilities. Education and ethical conduct would be crushed, coarseness in thought, speech, and manners would prevail, and dimness would darken the entire sky of our freedom in a few years, end quote. Chydenius's Freedom of Print Act was intended to vitalize political discussions. To achieve this objective, Chydenius asserted it was essential that the citizens had access to official documents in order to see how the state was run. 7 of the ordinance's 15 paragraphs were dedicated to detailing this public access. While the Administrative Procedures Act in America mandated information access, it rarely happened. Formalizing, quote, freedom of information access, end quote, for American citizens took longer. The American Society of Newspaper Editors commissioned Harold L. Cross, legal counsel for the New York Herald Tribune, to investigate the issue of excessive government secrecy. Cross's 1953 report was published as a book entitled The People's Right to Know. Cross wrote that virtually every part of American government operated under what amounted to an, quote, official cult of secrecy, end quote. That this secrecy had become, quote, a breeding ground for corruption, that it was leading to a rise in public mistrust in government, and that all of these things combined were doing serious damage to American democracy itself, end quote. Cross's 400-page report made the case that Congress must craft new legislation that gave American citizens greater access to the inner workings of their government. In the early 1950s, the People's Right to Know became a manual for the blossoming, quote, freedom of information, end quote, movement. In 1955, former businessman John Moss began a 12-year effort to codify Cross's recommendation by passing the Federal Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. On June 20th, 1966, it passed the House of Representatives, 306-0. It was then sent on to President Lyndon Johnson. Johnson opposed the legislation, but with a unanimous vote, 306-0, his veto would have been obsolete. So he signed it, and it became law on July 4th, 1966. On this 4th of July, we should celebrate this milestone in the public's power to observe government decisions and maintain checks on government power. It reminds us that citizens must remain constantly vigilant to protect our God-given rights. This essay, The Duty of the American People to Maintain Checks on Government Power, was written by Scot Faulkner. And Scot Faulkner is vice president of the George Washington Institute of Living Ethics at Shepherd University. My name is Janine Turner. I am the founder of Constituting America. I and Kathy Gillespie, Constituting America's CEO, thank you for joining us in our annual 90-day study. This is our 13th annual day study on the American founding principles. So please spread the word. It's so important because as our study is entitled, 90 plus 90 equals 180, history holds the key to the future. So knowing our history truly is the key to our future, especially to maintain our republic. So spread the word through emails, text, phone, in person, social media, and check out our essay from last year on American exceptionalism. It's truly a wonderful study and helps us have the tools in our toolbox when someone tells us America is not exceptional. It at least gives us tools to be able to have a civic conversation about how our founding documents have made America exceptional and protected our liberties, I might add. So check that out too. Have a wonderful day. We'll meet you right back here tomorrow.